The town of Autumn Ridge had never been much more than a name on a map. Nestled quietly between the rolling Appalachian foothills and the forgotten stretches of rural Pennsylvania, it was the kind of place where people still left their doors unlocked, where the same names appeared in the phone book for decades, and where children rode their bikes until the streetlights flickered to life. It wasn't famous for much, and that's the way the residents liked it. Life there was steady, predictable, safe. But on a grey morning in October of 1986, something happened that would shatter that quiet illusion forever. The day began like any other, though the air held the unmistakable scent of oncoming rain. At Autumn Ridge Elementary, a weathered red brick schoolhouse surrounded by oaks and faded swing sets, excitement buzzed in the halls. Miss Lynn Travers, a well-liked sixth-grade teacher with honey-blonde hair and a gentle voice, had organized a long-anticipated field trip for her class. The destination, Fox Hollow Caverns, a local limestone cave system about 2 hours away, known for its glittering stalactites and eerie underground silence. For small-town kids, it felt like an adventure into another world. 15 students boarded the school bus that morning. Each one had been given a permission slip to take home the week before, signed, returned, and triple-checked. Their names would be remembered for years in whispers and clipped news reports. Olivia Harron, the shy girl with a stutter, twins Mason and Morgan O'Leary, inseparable even in mischief. Danny Patel, a science whiz obsessed with rocks and minerals, and 11 others whose families would never stop hoping. The driver, Walter Greaves, had worked for the district for over 20 years. He was a widower in his late 50s, known for humming old folk songs as he drove and always offering peppermints from the front dash. The trip should have taken no more than an hour and 40 minutes. They left at 8:03 a.m. They were never seen again. By 10:30, the school's secretary grew uneasy when she couldn't reach the bus at the Caverns office line. By 11:15, the first call went out to the local sheriff, and by noon parents were pacing the cracked tiles of the elementary school's front office, their faces pale and confused. Some thought it was a mechanical issue, others wondered if the bus had simply gotten lost in the dense rural backroads. It was the 80s, cell phones weren't a lifeline yet, people still trusted time and patience, but by nightfall, Autumn Ridge was crawling with search crews. That night, the rain began. It rained for 3 days straight. Heavy, punishing sheets that turned dirt roads into slurries of mud and clouded visibility in every direction. Helicopters were grounded. Search dogs lost scent trails in the flooding creeks. Volunteers trudged through woods and ravines with flashlights, their boots sinking into the waterlogged ground, calling out names that were swallowed by the storm. The state police took over the investigation by day 4, then the FBI. The media arrived shortly after. Reporters lined the town's only motel and took over the diner, filming interviews on the sidewalks. Camera crews panned over rows of candlelit vigils, missing posters taped to telephone poles, and grieving parents holding photos of their children. The story made national headlines. 15 children and bus driver missing in rural Pennsylvania. Mystery of the vanished school bus deepens. Cavern trip turns to tragedy. But no answers came. Not that week, not that month. Not even that year. The theories began to swirl. A mechanical accident. Maybe the bus had skidded off a cliff or sunk into an abandoned mine shaft. A kidnapping. Some locals pointed fingers at Greaves, despite his spotless record. Others whispered about something more sinister. Cult activity, secret military experiments, or the unexplained phenomena that seemed to hover around the caves. No trace was ever found. No wreckage. No tire marks. No bodies. It was as though the bus, the children, and the driver had all vanished into thin air. Autumn Ridge slowly withered in the wake of the tragedy. Enrollment at the school dropped. Families moved away. Businesses shuttered. The town, once unremarkably alive, became shadowed by its loss. Lynn Travers left teaching altogether. She was placed on leave after several breakdowns, though no one ever blamed her directly. She refused to give interviews, and was last known to be living in upstate New York under a married name. Walter Greaves' family fought for his name to be cleared, but rumors dogged them for years. The Greaves house was eventually abandoned, and the bus, the old number 77 with its squeaky back axle and green vinyl seats, it was as though it had been erased. For nearly 4 decades, the case sat cold, files boxed and stored in a Harrisburg evidence facility. Year after year, anniversary articles were written, families aged, candles flickered out, the woods thickened, and then came the summer of 2025. In a quiet housing development being built 5 miles outside Autumn Ridge, on land that had once been a stretch of privately owned farmland, a construction crew hit something while digging foundation trenches. At first it seemed like old piping, a rusted piece of industrial metal, but as they dug, the outline took shape, curved, hollow, lined with rivets. It was a bus, half buried beneath nearly 4 feet of dense soil and roots, entombed in what had once been a dry gully, but had long since been overgrown and forgotten. The number on the side, though faded, was unmistakable. The discovery sent a ripple across the nation. News trucks returned, forensic teams arrived within hours, and for the first time in nearly 39 years, the families of Autumn Ridge had a piece of their children back. But what lay inside that bus would bring more questions than answers. As the sun sank behind the hills that evening, and police floodlights illuminated the grim outline of the recovered vehicle, silence once again fell over the town. The kind of silence that isn't peaceful, but pregnant with something old, buried, and watching. The morning after the bus disappeared, the town of Birch Hollow was smothered in silence. It wasn't the quiet of sleep or even of mourning, but the stunned hollow silence of uncertainty. Parents, grandparents, and neighbors gathered in front of the elementary school long before sunrise. Some held coffee, others gripped crumpled photographs. Everyone was waiting for something, news, a sign, anything that would break the unrelenting fog of not knowing. By 7 a.m., the local police had already put out an Amber Alert. State troopers blocked off the mountain road that led out to Carrion Ridge, while search teams fanned out along the path the bus was meant to take. The fire department brought in thermal imaging drones, and volunteers from 3 counties joined the search effort with flashlights, walking sticks, and strained expressions. But by nightfall they had found nothing. No bus, no tire tracks, no skid marks, no broken branches or oil slicks, not even a single dropped item of clothing. It was as if the vehicle, yellow and lumbering, had been lifted into the air and spirited away. The school's principal, Darla Hennessy, sat in a cramped interview room inside the sheriff's department late that night. She clutched a yellow legal pad in her lap, tapping it anxiously with her thumbnail. It was a standard field trip, she repeated, voice brittle. The kids were going to the Camp Wildwood site. Mr. Baker, Robert Baker, was the driver. He's been with the school for 6 years, never even had a speeding ticket. Detective Owen Marlin, who had taken over the case from local police, frowned. And they left at what time? 8:45 sharp. I saw them pull away from the school parking lot myself. You saw the bus leave? Yes, I waved to them. He scribbled in his notebook. Anyone else see the bus after that? Darla hesitated. Maybe, Mrs. Halpern. She lives along Old Quarry Road. I think she mentioned she saw the bus around 9. Mrs. Halpern was interviewed the next morning. She was 86, half blind and mostly deaf, but she was sharp. I saw that damned yellow thing go by. All right, she insisted. My little dog goes nuts whenever it passes. It was about 10 minutes before I was due to take my morning pills. So that would be, yes, 9 o'clock on the dot. That small confirmation narrowed the window, but also deepened the mystery. The bus had been seen leaving Birch Hollow. It had been seen traveling east toward Carrion Ridge. But after that, nothing. News crews descended quickly. By the second day, Birch Hollow's main street had become a media carnival. Reporters conducted interviews beside missing child posters hastily taped to trees. Helicopters thudded overhead. National networks began airing nightly updates. The names of the 15 children were read aloud on national television. Matthew Quinn, age 9, Ellie Romero, age 10, Dylan Carter, age 9, Grace Templeton, age 8, James Hann, age 10, Ava Riley, age 9, Liam Pierce, age 10, Sophia Nguyen, age 8, Noah Beck, age 9, Harper Wells, age 10, Daniel Brody, age 9, Amara Singh, age 8, Owen McCarthy, age 9, Jessica Dunleavy, age 9, Leo Prescott, age 10. These were real children, with real lives. Photos began to circulate online, school portraits, birthday parties, soccer games, a few grainy family vacations. The human toll of the mystery grew heavier by the hour. The driver, Robert Baker, age 57, was married, a father of 2, and a Vietnam veteran. He had driven buses for the district for 6 years without incident. His record was clean, he was dependable, if a little quiet. His wife Sharon was interviewed by police. He loved those kids, she told them, eyes swollen and red. He treated every one of them like his own grandkids. There's no way he would ever hurt them, no way. 3 days into the investigation, the case began to stall. The last confirmed sighting of the bus was at 9 a.m., near Mrs. Halprin's house. The route from there to Camp Wildwood passed through several forested miles, crossing an old wooden bridge and winding through a narrow mountain pass known as Briar Gap. The bridge showed no signs of a bus ever passing over it. No damage, no markings, nothing. "We're missing something," Marlin muttered as he stood near the wooden planks. A whole bus doesn't just vanish in the woods. Someone had to see something, but no one had. Not hikers, not rangers, not passing drivers, and no surveillance cameras existed that far out in 1986. It was one of those places where the world hadn't caught up yet. The state brought in scent tracking dogs, but even they lost the trail at the top of Briar Gap. The dogs whined, paced in circles, and sat down in the middle of the road as if confused. Some officers began to suggest the unthinkable. Could it have gone over a cliff? One asked. "We'd see signs," said another. "Debris, oil, broken trees." "There's nothing." One rumor suggested a sinkhole, but geologists ruled it out quickly. No major erosion, no collapse, and certainly nothing that would swallow a vehicle that size. It was as though the earth had simply opened up and closed behind it. On the 5th night of the search, a group of volunteers from the Birch Hollow Fire Department were combing a section of Carrion Ridge's southern slope, when one of them claimed to hear something. It was after midnight. The forest was dense, the underbrush thick. "I swear to God," said Jason Rayburn, a 28-year-old firefighter, "I heard kids laughing, not loud, not like playground loud. It was soft, like they were playing hide and seek." "Could have been the wind," one of the others said. Jason wasn't convinced. It was too rhythmic. "And then I heard a girl's voice say, 'He's coming, run,' just like that, clear as day." They combed the area for hours, and found nothing, no footprints, no evidence of children, no echo of laughter. Jason's story made it back to the sheriff, who dismissed it gently but firmly. "The mind plays tricks on you out there. Don't let it take you." Still, others began to report similar things. A local ranger swore he saw a yellow flicker through the trees late at night, like headlights behind a curtain of pines, but when he investigated, there was no vehicle, just empty forest, and the smell of motor oil that faded as quickly as it came. On day 7, a breakthrough, of sorts. A helicopter team flying over the Briar Gap trailhead spotted an unusual discoloration in the trees. It wasn't a clearing or a path, but a patch of scorched earth approximately 40 feet across. The area was remote, far off the main trail, tucked behind a steep incline. Rangers and police trekked out on foot, guided by GPS. What they found was puzzling. The ground had been charred in a perfect circle. No signs of fire had spread beyond that boundary. There were no burn marks on surrounding trees, no fallen branches or evidence of lightning strikes. The soil was baked solid. Inside the circle, the smell was strange, like sulfur and scorched rubber. A few melted scraps of plastic were found near the center, but no identifiable parts. A forensic team collected samples. When tested, they found traces of polyurethane foam, the kind used in school bus seating, but there were no metal fragments, no tires, no engine parts, nothing that proved a bus had been there except for the faintest echo of its existence. As days stretched into weeks, theories multiplied like wildfire. Some suggested mass abduction, others believed it was a cult, a rogue survivalist group hiding deep in the forest. Some insisted the bus never left Birch Hollow at all. More fringe ideas circulated, especially after the scorched circle was reported. UFO theorists took an interest, so did tabloids. The FBI became involved, but kept their findings tightly under wraps. "We are treating this as an ongoing investigation into a possible kidnapping," was the only public statement issued. Meanwhile, families were falling apart. Parents stopped going to work. Grief counselors flooded the school. Some families moved away altogether, unable to stay in a town that seemed frozen in a single moment. Still,
Every week people showed up in the woods, still searching, still waiting, still hoping. Deputy Clarence Holden's boots crunched over the dried mud that skirted the entrance to Pine Barrens Forest. A group of volunteers, mostly fathers from the missing children's classes, huddled together just inside the tree line. They'd been there since sunrise, fueled by lukewarm coffee and sleepless panic. The search was now over 36 hours in. What had begun as a bus took a wrong turn. Theory had shifted into something much darker, and yet there was still no skid marks, no bus tire tracks veering off-road, no broken branches, and not a single shoe print. The school bus and its passengers had seemingly disappeared between mile marker 221 and a stretch of road with no surveillance and no exit ramps. Clarence called Sheriff Doyle, who stood staring at an open map laid across the hood of his cruiser. If that bus veered off around this bend, say 400 yards before mile marker 221, it'd be heading straight into the edge of Pine Barrens. But the terrain is dense. No way a full-size bus could pass through without snapping half the undergrowth. Holden rubbed his jaw. Unless someone cleared a path first, or it never went off-road at all. Sheriff Doyle glanced up at him with narrowed eyes. "What you thinking?" Holden hesitated before responding. "Maybe the bus didn't leave the road at all. Maybe it never made it past the intersection at State Route 47. That intersection had come up before. Residents living near the old water tower on Route 47 had reported hearing what sounded like a large vehicle idling near the woods around 9:10 a.m., the morning of the disappearance, but no one had seen a school bus. That intersection was notoriously empty on weekday mornings, surrounded by rusted wire fences, overgrown fields, and a now defunct lumber mill. It was the sort of place no one went unless they were trying to disappear. Doyle muttered, "Check it again." Holden nodded and walked to his squad car, but instead of heading back down the highway, he detoured onto Route 47. He passed the faded lumber sign, where the paint had all but peeled away, revealing the splintered wood underneath. He slowed as he approached the water tower. It had gone unused for over a decade, and vines now coiled up its legs like choking fingers. Then he saw it, a small patch of disturbed soil just beyond the tree line, square-shaped, about the size of a tire. He parked on the shoulder and walked over, crouching low. There were 4 faint impressions, almost too shallow to detect, but they aligned too perfectly to be random. Tires. His pulse ticked up. He pushed further into the woods, carefully marking his trail with chalk on tree trunks. The woods opened up into a small clearing about 60 yards in, and there, flattened completely into the grass, was a rusted school lunchbox. He turned it over. The metal had rusted, but on the side, he could make out faint lettering, Garfield's School Days, the kind of lunchbox half the kids in the 80s carried. Holden stood slowly, and backed out of the clearing, mind racing. Back at the command center, hastily assembled in the cafeteria of Marlow Elementary, parents paced in silence while state police spoke quietly with local officers. One woman, Denise Keller, the mother of 9-year-old twins Paul and Mason, stood still and rigid. Her arms were folded tightly across her chest, lips pale from pressing them together so hard. "They're not lost," she said suddenly, loudly. "Someone took them." The room went quiet. It wasn't the first time someone had said it, but it was the first time someone had said it like that, with steel certainty. Detective Sam Velasquez of the Kentucky State Police stepped forward. "Mrs. Keller, I understand you're upset, but until we find definitive evidence of a crime," she cut him off. "I heard the rumors about what happened back in '68, the missing camper, the boys who disappeared near the railroad line. You think we don't remember, but we do." Velasquez's jaw tensed. That case had been buried deep. No arrests, no evidence, just 3 kids who never came home from a summer hike. Nothing official tied the cases, but locals had whispered for years that Pine Barrens had always been wrong. Denise's voice dropped to a whisper. "It's that forest. It doesn't give back what it takes." By the time Holden returned, dusk was falling and the trees were casting long shadows across the school's playground. He marched into the building, and found Doyle and Velasquez huddled over an aerial map of the county. "I found tire marks off Route 47, he said flatly, "about a mile north of the old lumber mill." Velasquez looked up. Tire marks from what? A bus, Holden replied, and I found a lunchbox. Rusted, crushed into the ground. Doyle stood slowly. You thinking the bus was taken there? I think it stopped there. I think something happened there. Velasquez straightened, his tone suddenly sharp. That's private land. It used to be owned by Moore Timber Company. Doyle turned to him. Used to. The company shut down in '85, filed bankruptcy. Land sat idle until it was bought last year. Some private developer, out-of-state firm. They planned to build cabins, but nothing ever broke ground. Holden rubbed his temples. Can we access it? Velasquez sighed. With probable cause, yes. Doyle was already grabbing his keys. Then we get it. Now. They reached the clearing off Route 47. By 9:22 p.m. spotlights lit the stretch of woods where Holden had found the tire marks. The soil was now cordoned off, and a crime scene unit was combing the area. Nearby, the rusted lunchbox had been placed in an evidence bag. I want GPR over this site, Velasquez ordered. Ground-penetrating radar. Tonight. The search team arrived with equipment around 10:30 p.m. They set up in total silence. Within 15 minutes, one of the radar operators raised his hand and called the detective over. Sir, he said, pointing at a screen, you're going to want to see this. A large object appeared beneath the surface, 10 feet wide, 30 feet long, metallic contours, hollow inside, buried approximately 6 feet deep. It's a vehicle, the technician confirmed. A big one. Velasquez stared at the screen. It's the bus. Holden swallowed. You said the land was sold last year. Who bought it? Velasquez nodded, already pulling out his notepad. Let's find out. Records from the Marlow County Registrar showed the deed had been transferred in February 2024 to a shell company named Sable Grove Developments LLC, with a listed address in Delaware and a P.O. box registered in Baltimore. No phone number, no email, just a mailing address, Velasquez said, pacing as he held the deed papers in one hand. Holden leaned over his shoulder. Check this out. He pointed to a scanned copy of the deed's last page. There was a signature. Nathaniel Breyer. Doyle looked up. That name familiar. Velasquez blinked. It should be. He paused, then turned to the whiteboard that had been set up for case notes. Breyer's father, Harlan Breyer, was one of the original founders of Moore Timber, owned that lumber mill. His son disappeared in 1986. Doyle's eyes narrowed. Wait, that can't be. Nathaniel was one of the kids. Velasquez nodded slowly. He was on the bus. The morning after the news broke that the buried school bus had been unearthed, a hush fell over Daggerhorn. National news crews arrived, their vans parked haphazardly along the forest edge. The townspeople, many of whom had grown up hearing about the vanishing of the 15 children, wandered to the edge of the crime scene, as if drawn by a gravitational pull. Sheriff Clay Harper hadn't slept, not even a wink. His office buzzed with state investigators and forensic experts, who had been flown in overnight. The crime scene, deep in the roots of Briar Glen, long assumed impassable by vehicle, was now a swamp of trampled earth, cables, survey markers, and portable floodlights. The school bus, still partially encased in the dense soil, had been cordoned off with tarps and protective tents. Preliminary excavation revealed something both expected and shocking: human remains. More specifically, 13 small skeletal remains were uncovered, most found slumped in their seats, as if they'd died right there, abandoned and waiting. 13, not 15. 2 were unaccounted for. Dr. Evelyn Zhang, a forensic anthropologist from the State Bureau, delivered the chilling update inside the sheriff's cramped office, just after sunrise. Most of the remains are consistent with children between the ages of 9 and 11, she said calmly, flipping through the preliminary field report. We believe the environmental conditions, moisture, sediment pressure, actually preserved parts of the clothing and belongings. She paused, and laid down a weathered item sealed in a plastic evidence bag. It was a child's sneaker, blue canvas with white laces. Sheriff Harper felt his stomach tighten. It was the same brand that had caused a stir in the original investigation. He remembered the old Polaroid in the file. A boy named Lucas Rayner had worn those exact shoes the day of the field trip. Dr. Zhang continued. We've also recovered several personal effects, lunchboxes, notebooks, school IDs. It will help with identification. But, she hesitated. What? Clay asked. There are 13 remains, not 15. The room fell silent. Clay reached for his notebook and stared at the names he'd rewritten so many times. They were burned into his memory. 15 children. If 13 were dead and accounted for, where were the other 2? Across town, Emma Ridley stood on her front porch, arms crossed tightly around her chest as she watched the buzzards circle in the morning sky. She'd barely spoken since the bus was found. Emma had been in 3rd grade in 1986. She wasn't on the field trip. She'd been homesick that day. But her cousin, Amelia Foster, had been one of the missing 15. I had the flu, she had told reporters yesterday. I remember begging my mom to let me go. Thank God she said no. Now Emma couldn't help but feel like fate had spared her by the thinnest margin, but it also cursed her, because she had grown up listening to her aunt's anguished wails every year on the anniversary. She'd seen how Amelia's parents withered with grief until they both died in a car accident in the 90s. Now that the bus had been found, people assumed closure had come, but for Emma, and so many others in Daggerhorn, the questions had only grown louder. Why was the bus buried? Who had done it? And most disturbing, if someone had wanted to cover up a tragic accident, why leave the remains inside? Back at the scene, excavation had slowed as forensic teams treated the site like a tomb. Every square inch was being combed over. Clay stood near the edge, drinking black coffee, and waiting for the lead CSI to finish cataloging the driver's compartment. That's when Agent Wyatt, the special investigator assigned by the FBI, approached with a clipboard and a grim expression. We found something odd. Clay raised an eyebrow. Define odd. Wyatt flipped the clipboard around. There, clipped beneath layers of plastic and evidence notes, was a photograph. It was old, tattered, slightly water-damaged, but the faces were clear. 4 children, sitting on a log, smiling at the camera. The angle suggested it had been taken deep in the woods, not at the school or museum. I don't recognize these kids, Clay said, frowning. One of our analysts matched the faces to the school yearbook from 1986. Wyatt explained. They're 4 of the missing children. Clay's eyes narrowed. Where was this photo found? Stuffed inside a tin lunchbox wedged between the rear seats. The implications hit them both at once. Someone took the photo after the bus left the museum, which meant the children had made it farther than anyone had assumed. The question now was who took it. That night, the town council convened an emergency meeting in the old church hall. It was packed. Locals sat shoulder to shoulder, murmuring, whispering, as Sheriff Harper took the stage. I know you all have questions, he began, scanning familiar faces. I want to be transparent. 13 sets of remains have been recovered from the bus site. We're working around the clock to identify them and determine cause of death. Forensic evidence strongly suggests they died shortly after the day they vanished. A few people gasped, others went still. But, he added, we have reason to believe the children were taken somewhere, possibly into the woods, before they died. Someone stood up in the back. It was Linda Marks, mother of one of the missing. My daughter Katie, she said, voice quaking. Did you find her bracelet? Harper hesitated, then slowly nodded. Yes, Mrs. Marks. It was found near the rear seats. We're running DNA now to confirm. She sat down, hands trembling. As the questions poured in, Clay knew the time was coming when the focus would shift from discovery to accountability. Someone had buried that bus. Someone had watched that field trip vanish. And now, 39 years later, that someone might still be out there. 2 days later, Agent Wyatt returned with the results from a deep sweep of the bus site. They had found tire impressions, a full set beneath the compacted earth near the tail of the bus. They're not consistent with a school bus, Wyatt explained. Too narrow, but they match tires used on 1970 SIP model pickup trucks. Clay's jaw tightened. Meaning what? Meaning someone followed the bus, helped bury it, or returned after the fact. Could they tell when? Wyatt nodded. Best guess, sometime around 1989, 3 years after the disappearance. Clay looked at the evidence board in his office. He walked up to the dusty corner, where the maintenance logs were pinned. 3 years later, Right after the FBI closed the case, he murmured. That was when the school budget had changed. The principal had retired. Some records were purged. Someone had waited for the noise to die down, then covered their tracks. That evening, Clay returned to his family's farmhouse outside town. He needed rest, but as he stood on his porch, looking toward the woods, a memory tugged at him. It was a rumor from the late 90s. He had just joined the sheriff's department, fresh out of the academy. An old trapper named Jess Barlow had called in a tip, claimed to have found a rusted school lunch tray deep in Briar Glen, near an abandoned root cellar.
Back then, no one had taken Jess seriously. He'd been drinking, slurring his words. They assumed it was a lost hiker's trash or old storm debris. But now, Clay grabbed his flashlight and boots. Briar Glen had always been dense. The trees here grew in gnarled clusters, branches like fingers clawing at the sky. The flashlight cut a narrow path through the underbrush, lighting the deer trails and rotting leaves. Clay moved slowly, listening. Then, about 30 minutes in, he found it, a wooden hatch door, nearly consumed by moss and vines. He knelt, brushed it off, and pulled. The hinges groaned. A stench wafted up, damp, metallic, old. He descended the steps one at a time. The beam from his flashlight hit the far wall. What he saw made his blood run cold. Dozens of them. Children's stick figures, names written in shaky block letters, some crossed out in red. And at the center of the wall, a map, a crude layout of the forest, marked with circles. One was labeled, the pit, another, the quiet room, and then at the very top, he watches. Clay stumbled back, because beside the writing was something else, a child's handprint, fresh. The morning after the discovery of the buried school bus, the small town of Millersville was alive with whispers and speculation. The news had spread like wildfire, and reporters had already started to arrive from nearby cities, eager to cover what was quickly becoming a baffling and chilling mystery. The discovery of the bus, hidden beneath a thick layer of earth on an abandoned farm at the edge of town, reopened wounds that many had thought long healed or buried forever. The excavation site was now cordoned off by police tape, with detectives, forensic experts, and archaeologists working side by side to uncover every detail. The bus itself was in remarkably good condition, considering it had been underground for nearly 4 decades. Its yellow paint, though faded and cracked, was still visible beneath the grime, and the windows, some cracked but mostly intact, reflected the cold autumn sky. Detective Laura Martinez had been assigned to the case shortly after the initial discovery. She was a seasoned investigator, known for her meticulous attention to detail and an unwavering determination to get to the truth. As she stood near the excavation site, her eyes scanning the surroundings, she couldn't help but feel the weight of the unsolved tragedy pressing down on her. 15 children had vanished without a trace in 1986, and now, with the bus found buried, the puzzle pieces were starting to fall into place, but they also raised new questions. The first task was to confirm if any remains or personal belongings of the missing children were still inside the bus. Forensic teams brought in specialized equipment to scan the interior without disturbing potential evidence. X-rays and ground-penetrating radar revealed fragments scattered across the floor, which experts hoped were pieces of clothing or school supplies. But what the teams really wanted was definitive proof of what had happened during those terrifying moments so many years ago. Inside the bus, the seats were coated with decades of dust and soil. Among the debris, a small weathered backpack was uncovered, its fabric brittle, but the distinctive pattern unmistakable to those who remembered the children's favorite styles of the mid-80s. The name tag inside read Emily Carter, a 10-year-old girl who had been on the ill-fated field trip. Finding her belongings was a breakthrough, a tangible link to the past that breathed life back into a case many had feared would remain unsolved forever. Meanwhile, in the town's police department, cold case files that had gathered dust for years were being pulled out and examined under new light. Detectives pored over witness statements, old interviews and maps of the original field trip route. One name kept appearing in multiple documents, a local man named Harold Jensen, a reclusive figure who had lived near the route where the children had disappeared. Jensen had been questioned back in 1986, but never formally charged or linked to the case. New interviews were scheduled with residents who had been in town at the time. Some remembered strange noises or flashes of light near the farm where the bus was now found. Others recounted seeing a strange vehicle parked along the old country road on the day the children vanished. These memories, once dismissed as unreliable, now demanded serious consideration. Detective Martinez also uncovered reports of similar disappearances in nearby towns during the 1980s, cases that had never been connected. The possibility of a serial offender, or even a network involved in child abductions, began to emerge. This theory added a chilling dimension to the case, suggesting that the tragedy at Millersville might have been part of something much larger and more sinister. Amidst the renewed investigation, the families of the missing children gathered in the town hall for a memorial service. Many had waited nearly 4 decades for answers, living with the unbearable pain of uncertainty. Tears were shed, prayers were whispered, and a shared hope for closure hung heavy in the room. As the sun set over Millersville, the excavation continued under floodlights, each unearthed item bringing new pieces of the story into focus. Detective Martinez knew that the coming days would be critical. The truth had been buried for 39 years, but now, at last it was coming to light. The haunting mystery of the vanished children was far from over, and every step closer to the truth brought them face to face with the dark shadows lurking beneath the surface of their quiet town. The days following the discovery of the buried school bus unfolded with a frenetic energy that seemed almost surreal in the quiet town of Millersville. What had once been a sleepy, forgotten corner of the world was now a hive of activity, where investigators, forensic experts, journalists and townsfolk converged, all drawn by the unsettling resurgence of a tragedy long thought to be frozen in time. Detective Laura Martinez, her determination hardened by the mounting pressure, found herself caught between the relentless pursuit of answers and the emotional toll of reopening wounds for a grieving community. Each morning began before dawn, the cold biting through her coat as she walked to the excavation site to oversee the painstaking search for evidence. The bus remained the central focus. Every inch of its interior was combed through with methodical precision. Forensic teams sifted through decades of dirt and decay, recovering fragments of belongings, tattered clothing, broken toys, fragments of notebooks and crayons, each item a silent testament to the lives abruptly disrupted on that fateful day in 1986. Among the most heartbreaking discoveries was a small cracked music box, adorned with delicate painted flowers, found wedged beneath a bus seat. It was identified as belonging to Jacob Miller, a boy remembered by his mother as having an endless love for music. The music box, once a source of joy, now lay mute, a somber relic echoing the silence of lost childhood. As the investigation deepened, Detective Martinez and her team faced a daunting challenge, piecing together what had happened in the hours following the children's disappearance. The original case files, though extensive, were frustratingly incomplete, with gaps and inconsistencies that hinted at a hurried and perhaps flawed initial investigation. Interviews with survivors, relatives and witnesses from 1986 were re-examined, and new interviews were conducted with anyone who might shed light on the mystery. One such witness was Ellen Parsons, who had been a young woman living near the farm at the time. Ellen's memory was hazy, but she recalled hearing raised voices and the sound of an engine running late into the evening on the day the children vanished. "I didn't think much of it back then," Ellen admitted during her recent interview. "Farms are noisy places, and people come and go all the time. But now, with what we know, it feels like something more sinister was happening." Her testimony, though fragmented, added to the growing suspicion that the bus had been deliberately concealed on the property. The question was why, and who had been responsible. Detective Martinez turned her focus back to Harold Jensen, the reclusive man whose presence near the site had been noted but never fully explored. Jensen had died in the late 1990s, leaving behind a trail of rumors and half-truths. Some townsfolk remembered him as a gruff, solitary figure who kept to himself. Others whispered darker tales of strange noises and unexplained lights around his property. Though Jensen could no longer be questioned, his history was scrutinized in detail. Police records revealed minor offenses, vandalism, petty theft, but nothing that would suggest a violent or criminal pattern serious enough to link him directly to the disappearance. However, his isolation and proximity to the burial site made him a focal point for renewed investigation. Detectives also explored the property where the bus was found, uncovering a small concealed underground cellar beneath the soil where the bus lay. The cellar was empty, but the evidence suggested it had been used in some capacity during the 1980s. Soil samples and remnants of charred wood indicated possible attempts to destroy or hide evidence, though what had been burned remained a mystery. The discovery raised disturbing possibilities. Was the bus hidden to cover up a crime? Was there more buried on that land, yet to be uncovered? The eerie silence of the cellar seemed to guard secrets that had long been swallowed by the earth. As forensic science advanced, so too did the hope for new breakthroughs. DNA analysis was applied to the recovered personal items, seeking to identify remains or traces left by the missing children or a possible perpetrator. The process was slow and painstaking, but each match or exclusion brought a clearer picture of the past. Meanwhile, the families of the missing children were swept up in a torrent of emotions. For some, the discovery brought a fragile hope. For others, it reopened the raw pain of loss and unanswered questions. Support groups and counseling sessions became a vital resource as the community struggled to navigate the turbulent waters of grief and uncertainty. In the midst of the chaos, a local historian named Margaret Hayes offered a different perspective. Margaret had spent years chronicling the history of Millersville and its surrounding areas, uncovering stories long buried in dusty archives. She suggested that the disappearance of the children might be connected to a series of unusual events documented in the early 1980s. Strange disappearances, unexplained sightings, and whispered tales of a shadowy figure known locally as the Watcher. Margaret's research pointed to a pattern. Before the children vanished, several other young people had disappeared from neighboring towns, their cases quietly closed or forgotten. The possibility of a serial predator, or an organized network operating across the region, was no longer just speculation, but a growing theory among investigators. The notion chilled Detective Martinez. If true, it meant the tragedy was not isolated, but part of something far more sinister and far-reaching. To pursue this lead, she assembled a task force to connect the dots between cases, analyzing timelines, locations, and victims' profiles. The work was exhaustive, often frustrating, but slowly it began to reveal unsettling connections. One particularly haunting lead came from a former police officer named Frank Dawson, who had worked in a nearby town during the 1980s. Frank spoke of a man who had been arrested multiple times for child endangerment, but never convicted due to lack of evidence. The man had disappeared around the same time as the Millersville incident. Back then, we didn't have the technology or the resources we have today, Frank said. Sometimes things slipped through the cracks. I think we missed something big. This revelation underscored the importance of revisiting cold cases with fresh eyes and modern techniques. The past was no longer a closed book but an active investigation with the potential to bring justice and closure. As the weeks wore on, the excavation site continued to yield small but significant clues. A faded class photograph, carefully preserved beneath a seat, showed the smiling faces of the children before the trip, a stark contrast to the grim reality that had followed. Names and stories emerged from the shadows, transforming statistics into individuals whose lives mattered deeply. Detective Martinez kept a worn notebook filled with timelines, witness accounts and leads. Every night she reviewed the day's findings, searching for patterns or inconsistencies that might unlock the mystery. One night, as rain pounded against her office window, a breakthrough came from an unexpected source. A letter found among Harold Jensen's belongings, discovered in a sealed box at the local archive. The letter, dated shortly after the disappearance, was addressed to an unknown recipient, and hinted at knowledge of the children's fate. It read, "They never should have gone there.
The secrets buried beneath that land are darker than anyone knows. I fear the worst has come to pass, but no one dares to speak the truth. The letter was unsigned, and its cryptic warning only deepened the mystery. Who had written it? What secrets did it hint at? And could it finally provide the missing link that would unravel the decades-old enigma? Detective Martinez knew the answers lay somewhere in the shadows of Millersville's past, hidden in the dirt, whispered in old rumors, and locked away in the hearts of those who had survived. The journey to uncover the truth was far from over, and every revelation brought them closer to understanding the tragedy that had shattered 15 young lives and forever changed a town. The past was no longer silent. It was speaking urgently, hauntingly, and with a promise that one day justice would be served. The letter found in Harold Jensen's belongings sent a shiver through Detective Laura Martinez's team. Its ominous tone and cryptic warning cast a new light over a case that had already twisted through years of grief and unanswered questions. Now it seemed there was more lurking beneath the surface, secrets that someone had tried desperately to hide. The discovery of the letter marked a turning point. It was as if the past was suddenly pressing in, demanding to be heard, to be understood, and Detective Martinez, fueled by a mixture of frustration and determination, vowed that she would not rest until every shadow had been brought into the light. For weeks the investigative team pored over the letter's contents, dissecting every word and phrase. They consulted handwriting experts to try and identify its author, but the handwriting was deliberately cautious, meant to disguise rather than reveal. They traced the paper's origin, but the stationery was common enough to offer little clue. The one lead that seemed promising was the mention of secrets buried beneath that land. What exactly was hidden beneath the soil of the Jensen property? The excavation site had already yielded the buried school bus and the small cellar beneath the ground, but what else could be concealed in the dark earth? Expanding the search radius, the team began to survey the surrounding woods and fields. Using ground-penetrating radar, they scanned for anomalies, unusual shapes or disturbances beneath the surface. Days turned into nights filled with tense anticipation. One afternoon, the radar picked up something irregular about a quarter-mile from the bus's location, a series of small rectangular depressions arranged in a rough line. Investigators quickly dug into the earth, uncovering a shallow grave, an unmarked, hastily dug pit containing fragmented human remains. Forensic anthropologists arrived promptly to analyze the bones. The team hoped desperately the remains belonged to one of the missing children, which could bring answers, but also renewed sorrow. The fragile bones told stories. Some were too young to be adults, consistent with children around the age of the missing, but the condition of the remains made identification difficult. DNA testing was expedited. Meanwhile, the team turned their attention to the history of the Jensen property, digging into old land records, photographs, and town archives. They found that the land had been owned for decades by the Jensen family, though Harold had lived alone in the final years. Stories circulated among townspeople about the family's decline, tragic accidents, disappearances, and whispered warnings that no one ever took seriously. Harold Jensen himself had been a man of contradictions. While some remembered him as a quiet loner, others spoke of strange behaviors, fascination with occult books, odd symbols carved into trees around the property, and late-night fires that filled the air with acrid smoke. These rumors, dismissed at the time as the product of small-town gossip, now took on a chilling significance. Detective Martinez realized that understanding Harold Jensen's mind might be key. She requested a psychological profile be drawn based on interviews with those who had known him, and reports from social services and law enforcement. What emerged was a picture of a man deeply troubled, battling inner demons, and possibly involved in acts far darker than anyone had imagined. He had a history of mental illness, including severe paranoia and delusions, but had never been committed or institutionalized. Most disturbing was the suggestion from some witnesses that Harold had an unhealthy obsession with children, especially those who wandered near his property. There were reports from neighbors about children being warned not to approach the Jensen farm, but no official complaints had ever been filed. Meanwhile, The families of the missing children grappled with the resurgence of the investigation. For many, the pain was unbearable, but there was also a sense of fragile hope, hope that after nearly 4 decades, the truth might finally emerge. One mother, Grace Campbell, whose son Tommy had vanished on the day of the trip, became a vocal advocate for justice. She worked closely with Detective Martinez, sharing memories, photographs, and even digging through old boxes in her attic for anything that might help. Tommy was more than a name on a list, Grace told the detective one afternoon, her voice steady but laced with sorrow. He was a boy who loved baseball, who dreamed of being a firefighter. We owe it to him, and all of them, to find out what happened. Grace's involvement brought the human cost of the tragedy into sharp focus for the investigators. They were not just uncovering a cold case, they were unraveling shattered lives. Back at the excavation site, progress was slow but steady. The uncovering of the shallow grave led to more searches that turned up additional human remains in small clusters, suggesting the possibility that multiple victims might be buried in scattered, concealed spots rather than a single mass grave. Forensic teams worked tirelessly, using the latest technology to recover and analyze every fragment. Dental records, DNA profiling, and isotope analysis began to piece together the identities and even the geographical origins of some victims. One poignant discovery was the identification of Emily Ross, a quiet girl remembered for her love of animals and gentle nature. Her remains were found close to the original burial site of the bus, along with a small collection of personal items, her favorite book, a broken bracelet, and a photograph of her with her family. The identification of Emily, and later a few others, was both a victory and a heartbreak. It confirmed that the children had met tragic ends, and that the land held the secrets of their final moments. As the investigation continued, the shadow of the past seemed to grow heavier. More revelations surfaced about Harold Jensen's connections. In a dusty trunk found in an abandoned barn on the property, investigators discovered journals and notebooks filled with cryptic entries, drawings of children, and references to rituals and dark beliefs. The writings spoke of protection and sacrifice, hinting at an obsession that blurred the lines between reality and delusion. Detective Martinez read through the journals with a mixture of fascination and revulsion. Some entries were incoherent ramblings, others were chillingly clear. One passage read, "They must be kept safe from the darkness that hunts the innocent. The price is high, but necessary. I am the shield, I am the watcher." The writings hinted at a twisted logic that might explain why the children were hidden, why the bus was buried. Was Harold Jensen trying to protect them, or had he become the architect of their fate? Local law enforcement, historians and even paranormal investigators became involved, drawn by the eerie nature of the case. While the paranormal theories did not fit within the scope of the official investigation, they added to the lore surrounding the Jensen property, attracting media attention and increasing public interest. Detective Martinez, however, focused on the facts, on piecing together what human actions had caused this tragedy. She remained skeptical of the supernatural, but acknowledged that the hysteria and fear surrounding the property had long been part of the community's collective memory. In a quiet moment at the police station, Martinez reflected on the enormity of what lay before her. The children who vanished on that day in 1986 had been swallowed by silence for too long, but now their stories were emerging, fragile but undeniable. The task ahead was daunting. The next steps involved cross-referencing every piece of evidence, re-interviewing witnesses, and preparing for what might be the most difficult revelations yet. She understood that justice would not come easily, but the echoes of those lost children demanded it. As the sun set over Millersville, casting long shadows across the land where so much had been buried, the investigation pressed on, driven by memory, truth and the unwavering hope that one day, the vanished children would finally be brought home. The investigation into the disappearance of the 15 children and the discovery of the buried school bus on the Jensen property had already stretched over months, stirring waves of anguish and renewed hope across Millersville and beyond. Yet as Detective Laura Martinez and her team pressed deeper into the labyrinths of the past, they encountered one of the most difficult barriers: time itself. Decades had passed since that fateful day in 1986. Memories faded or twisted with age. Witnesses had moved away, changed names or passed on. And for many the trauma was so deeply buried that confronting it meant reopening old wounds, fears and regrets. Still, Detective Martinez knew that if there was any chance of uncovering the full truth, they needed to find new witnesses, or at least jog the fractured recollections of those who had once been close to the case. The first step was to revisit the families of the missing children, encouraging them to share anything they had never revealed or had forgotten. The passage of time had sometimes softened the sharp edges of grief enough for memories to resurface. One afternoon, Martinez met with Richard and Elaine Thompson, parents of 9-year-old Lisa Thompson, who had vanished that day along with the others. The Thompsons were hesitant at first, still haunted by their loss, but eventually, they agreed to talk. Richard spoke quietly, recalling how Lisa had been excited for the field trip, chatting endlessly about the animals they might see, and the chance to explore the woods. But there was something else, a fear he hadn't noticed until much later. "She came home the night before the trip," Richard said, his voice catching, "and she was scared. Said she didn't want to go to that place. I thought she was just being a kid, afraid of the unknown, but now I wonder if she sensed something we didn't." Elaine added that Lisa had mentioned a man who lived near the forest, someone who watched the children when they played outside. "We told her to stay away from strangers," Elaine said, tears brimming, "but none of us realized. Maybe that stranger wasn't just a stranger." This revelation spurred the team to look for any reports or complaints from that era about suspicious persons near the school or the bus route. With a renewed focus, the team reached out to former residents of Millersville, seeking anyone who might recall unusual occurrences around the time of the disappearance. It was a long shot, but persistence paid off. An elderly man named Frank Dawson came forward. Now in his 70s, Dawson had been a maintenance worker for the school district back in 1986. He told Martinez that he had noticed strange behavior from Harold Jensen in the months leading up to the children's disappearance. "Harold was a strange one," Dawson said, leaning forward. "He'd been seen wandering near the bus stop late at night, sometimes carrying tools or shovels. I thought maybe he was just restless, or had some personal project. Never imagined it had anything to do with those poor kids." Dawson also recalled a specific incident a few weeks before the field trip. "One evening, I was driving past the Jensen place, and I saw a group of kids near the edge of the woods. Harold was there too, yelling at them to get away. They scattered fast. I didn't think much of it then." Another breakthrough came from a much younger source, Marcus Reed, who had been 10 years old at the time, and had attended the same elementary school as the missing children. Marcus was reluctant to come forward at first, the memories painful and confusing after so many years. But with patience and gentle questioning from the investigators, he began to open up. He recalled the day of the field trip vividly. "We were all excited," Marcus said, fidgeting nervously in the interview room. "But then I saw something weird. Harold Jensen was near the bus. He looked angry, like he didn't want us there." Marcus told of how Jensen had approached the bus as the children were boarding, muttering threats under his breath, his eyes wild. "I heard him say something like, 'You shouldn't be here. This place isn't safe for you.' I was scared." More hauntingly, Marcus admitted to seeing something no one had reported before, a strange figure watching from the shadows of the forest, someone who did not look like Harold but seemed connected. "I don't know who it was," Marcus said, voice trembling, "but it gave me chills." The description of this mysterious figure spurred a new line of inquiry. Who could this person have been? And how were they connected to the disappearance? Detective Martinez's team scoured old police reports and local archives, looking for anyone matching the description, or any unusual sightings around the Jensen property in 1986. Their search uncovered a series of reports filed by several residents about a man named Carl Haynes, a drifter known to occasionally live near the woods. He was described as tall, gaunt, with piercing eyes and an unpredictable temper. Further investigation revealed that Haynes had a criminal record, including minor offenses and accusations of threatening behavior. However, at the time of the children's disappearance, there was no record of Haynes being connected to any serious crime. The team tried to locate Haynes, but found no current address or confirmed whereabouts. A review of local hospital and mental health records suggested he might have been institutionalized or had left the area years ago. As the new witness statements came in, the team worked to reconstruct the timeline of the day the children vanished. From Marcus Reed's account, combined with other statements and bus driver logs, a pattern began to emerge. The bus left the school at approximately 9 a.m., heading toward the nature reserve as planned. Upon arriving, the children disembarked, eager to explore. Harold Jensen's interference at the bus was unexpected and unexplained, but witnesses suggested he had been agitated for days prior. The presence of the unknown figure lurking near the forest added to the confusion and danger that day.
The renewed attention to the case stirred mixed reactions in Millersville. Some residents welcomed the investigation, eager for closure and justice. Others feared reopening wounds or casting suspicion on neighbors. The local media picked up the story, framing it as a mystery that had haunted the town for decades and was finally unraveling. Public forums and community meetings became platforms for heated discussion. Some residents shared memories and theories, while others insisted the case was best left to the authorities. Amid the tension, Detective Martinez remained focused on the facts, committed to piecing together the puzzle with care and respect. As the investigation deepened, the emotional toll on the families and witnesses became increasingly apparent. Several parents who had long struggled with grief began to experience renewed trauma. Therapy groups formed, offering support to those affected. Marcus Reed, the young witness, sought counseling to process his memories and the fear that had haunted him since childhood. Detective Martinez made mental health resources a priority, understanding that the case was about more than just solving a crime. It was about healing broken lives. Unexpected discoveries. One of the more startling revelations came from a local historian, Dr. Eleanor Graves, who offered a fresh perspective on the area's dark history. Graves uncovered records of previous disappearances and unexplained deaths near the Jensen property dating back to the 1950s. She posited that the land had long been a site of tragedy, with patterns of loss that went unnoticed or unconnected. This historical context added layers of complexity, suggesting that the 1986 disappearance might have been part of a larger, more sinister pattern. With new leads and fresh insights, the investigation intensified. Detective Martinez's team worked long hours, driven by the urgency to find answers before more time could erode evidence and memories further. They scheduled another excavation near the new grave site, hopeful that more remains or artifacts could be uncovered to shed light on what had truly happened. Simultaneously, the team pursued efforts to locate Carl Haynes, hoping that if found, he might provide crucial information or be linked to the case. As Part 7 closed, Detective Martinez stood once again on the Jensen property, watching the autumn leaves drift to the ground. The weight of history pressed down, but so did the weight of hope for justice, for truth, and for the voices long silenced to finally be heard. The story of the 15 children lost on a field trip nearly 40 years ago was far from over. And with every new discovery, every new memory recovered, the shadows began to retreat, just a little. The chill of early winter was settling over Millersville, and the days grew shorter and grayer, mirroring the somber mood that gripped the town. As the investigation into the 1986 disappearance of the 15 children stretched on, Detective Laura Martinez found herself navigating not only the labyrinth of evidence, but also the tangled web of human memory and emotion. The excavation site on the Jensen property had yielded some new findings, but nothing conclusive enough to close the case. Yet each new artifact, each shard of bone or fragment of clothing, was a piece of the puzzle, a silent testimony to the lives that had been lost and the secrets still buried beneath the soil. After weeks of careful digging and cataloging, the forensic team brought some of the recovered items back to the lab for detailed analysis. Among them were several small personal effects, buttons, a broken wristwatch, and fragments of fabric that through DNA testing were tentatively linked to some of the missing children. More intriguingly, the team discovered small traces of soil and plant matter on these items that did not match the typical flora of the Jensen property. This suggested that the children, or at least their belongings, had been moved or hidden in a location other than the immediate burial site. Dr. Samuel Chen, the lead forensic anthropologist, explained the significance during a briefing with the investigative team. "This is an important clue," he said, carefully. "It means the current burial site may not be the original location where the children, or some of them, were kept or harmed. It raises the possibility that there was a secondary site, possibly a holding place, or even a location related to the initial crime." This revelation widened the scope of the investigation. The search area expanded beyond the Jensen property to include other parts of the surrounding forest and abandoned buildings in Millersville. Detective Martinez and her team began canvassing the area with renewed urgency. Satellite imagery was reviewed, looking for changes in terrain or unusual markings that could indicate hidden graves or tunnels. Interviews with longtime residents uncovered stories of old, unused barns and overgrown sheds, places that had once been whispered about as off-limits or haunted. One particularly chilling tip came from Marjorie West, an elderly woman who had grown up near the woods. "There's an old quarry about a mile from here," she said, voice trembling slightly. "It's been closed for years, but the kids used to dare each other to go there. I remember hearing strange noises coming from there sometimes, but no one ever went close enough to find out what they were." Intrigued by the tip, the team organized a day-long search of the quarry site, combing through debris and checking for any signs of human remains or artifacts. The search proved frustratingly barren at first, but a breakthrough came when a young officer spotted a faint trail leading from the quarry deeper into a thicket of brambles and thorn bushes. Following the trail, the team came upon a small clearing partially concealed by overgrown brush and fallen trees. In the center of the clearing lay the rusted remains of what appeared to be an old camper trailer, its windows shattered and the interior decayed. Inside, remnants of belongings were scattered: a children's backpack, a cracked photo frame and scraps of clothing. The scene was a stark reminder that this place had not been abandoned for long, and that it might have been a hideout or holding area connected to the children's disappearance. Detective Martinez called in the forensic team immediately, and a thorough sweep of the area was conducted. They found faint footprints, worn paths indicating frequent use, and more fragments of bone later confirmed to belong to one of the missing children. The chilling reality was settling in. The children had been moved multiple times, their captivity and eventual deaths involving more than one location. The complexity of the case deepened further when Martinez started considering the possibility of accomplices. Was Harold Jensen acting alone, or was there someone else, possibly the mysterious figure Marcus Reed had seen in the woods, that had played a role? Interviews with people who had known Jensen revealed a man who was not only secretive, but also had occasional visitors at odd hours. Some neighbors recalled strange cars coming and going late at night, and once the sight of a large man with a beard unfamiliar to the town. Detective Martinez wondered if Jensen was part of a larger network, or if someone had coerced or assisted him in his crimes. In the midst of these developments, an unexpected witness came forward, a woman named Sarah Collins, who had been a teenager in Millersville in 1986. Sarah's voice trembled as she recounted a secret she had kept for nearly 40 years. "I didn't want to say anything before," she admitted, "because I was scared. I thought no one would believe me. But I can't stay silent anymore." Sarah said that on the day of the disappearance, she had seen several adults gathering near the Jensen property, speaking in hushed tones. Among them was a man she recognized as Carl Haynes, the drifter previously mentioned by witnesses. They were arguing, Sarah recalled. "It looked like something had gone wrong. One of the men, Harold Jensen I think, was angry, shouting about keeping things quiet. Carl looked scared." Sarah's testimony was one of the first clear indications that the disappearance involved more than a single person, and that there was tension and fear among the perpetrators. With this new information, the team intensified efforts to locate Carl Haynes. After days of searching, they found records indicating he had been admitted to a psychiatric hospital in a neighboring state in the early 1990s.
Detective Martinez traveled to the hospital, where she was able to review medical and psychological reports. Haynes had been diagnosed with severe paranoia and delusions, but there were notes suggesting he might have had knowledge of criminal activity. Martinez requested a meeting with Haynes, hoping to glean information that could break the case open. The interview was tense. Haynes was evasive at first, his eyes darting nervously. "I don't remember much," he said, voice shaky. "It was a long time ago. Things got complicated." But as Martinez pressed gently, he began to reveal fragments of the truth. He admitted to knowing Jensen and being involved in some way, though he denied any direct harm to the children. They were supposed to be kept quiet. "Not harmed," he said, cryptically. But things got out of hand. Harold, he lost control. Though Haynes' mental state made it difficult to discern fact from delusion, his account supported the theory that multiple people were involved and that the disappearance was not a simple, isolated event. As these revelations unfolded, the town of Millersville grew increasingly anxious. The idea that trusted neighbors might have been complicit in such a heinous crime stirred unease and suspicion. Community leaders organized forums to address concerns, while law enforcement reassured the public that the investigation was progressing steadily. Some residents took it upon themselves to form neighborhood watch groups, determined to protect their children from any lingering threat. The burden of justice for Detective Martinez, the case had become more than just a cold investigation. It was a mission to give voice to those who had been silenced, and to bring a measure of peace to grieving families. She reflected on the many challenges, the gaps in evidence, the passage of time, the layers of secrecy, but also on the resilience of the human spirit. Every day she reminded herself, justice was worth the struggle. With new leads pointing to multiple suspects and several possible crime scenes, the investigation was far from over. Detective Martinez's team prepared to expand their search for evidence beyond the current sites, coordinating with state and federal agencies for assistance. Plans were made for more interviews, psychological evaluations, and forensic testing. Though the road ahead was daunting, the pieces of the puzzle were beginning to come together, slowly, painfully, but inexorably. As winter deepened, the shadows over Millersville grew longer, but so did the determination of those seeking the truth. The disappearance of the 15 children was no longer just a cold case, it was a living, breathing quest for answers that would demand courage, compassion, and unwavering resolve. The winter wind bit sharply as Detective Laura Martinez returned to Millersville from the psychiatric hospital where she had interviewed Carl Haynes. The coldness in the air was a stark contrast to the turmoil brewing beneath the surface of the town. The investigation into the disappearance of the 15 children had grown far beyond a single perpetrator and a single crime scene. Now it was clear there was a hidden network, a web of secrets stretching across years and layers of complicity. In the days following the meeting with Haynes, Martinez and her team delved deeper into the backgrounds of everyone connected to Harold Jensen and Carl Haynes. Financial records, phone calls, visitor logs, and police reports were scoured meticulously. What emerged was a pattern, a string of connections between Jensen, Haynes, and several other men with shadowy pasts. Among the names uncovered was Gregory Miles, a local businessman with a history of accusations of child exploitation that had never led to charges due to lack of evidence. Miles was known for his philanthropy on the surface, sponsoring local youth programs and donating to schools, but rumors and hushed conversations suggested something darker. Further investigation revealed that Gregory Miles had visited the Jensen property multiple times in the months leading up to the children's disappearance, often late at night. Martinez's team discovered phone records revealing coded conversations between Jensen, Miles, and other unknown numbers. The encrypted messages hinted at arrangements and warnings, references to quiet keeping, moving the cargo, and changes in the schedule. Determined to understand the full scope, the detective requested wiretaps and surveillance on these suspects. It became evident that these men formed part of an underground ring, involved in the trafficking and exploitation of children. The investigation's findings sent shockwaves through Millersville. Many residents refused to believe that some of their most respected citizens could be involved in such atrocities. Others admitted to having had suspicions, but had been too afraid or too willing to turn a blind eye. Detective Martinez received an anonymous letter during this time. "It was brief but chilling. You're getting close. But be careful, some things are meant to stay buried." Though unnerved, Martinez took it as confirmation that she was on the right path. With mounting evidence, the authorities urged Sarah Collins, the young woman who had come forward, to enter witness protection. She agreed, terrified but resolute to help. Sarah's detailed accounts provided the investigation with critical insights. She described secret meetings in abandoned buildings, children being handed over in small groups, and threats that kept witnesses silent for decades. Through her testimony, Martinez learned that the children had been held in multiple locations, some still undiscovered. Based on Sarah's information, teams expanded the search into several old derelict properties on the outskirts of Millersville and neighboring counties. One particular site was a long-abandoned textile mill shut down in the early 1980s. Local legend held that it was haunted, but few had explored it recently. The mill was a sprawling, decaying structure, filled with rusted machinery, broken windows, and a pervasive silence that felt heavy and oppressive. Inside the textile mill, investigators found a concealed basement accessed through a trapdoor beneath a pile of debris. The basement was large, with multiple small rooms separated by crumbling walls. Some rooms had remnants of beds and children's drawings scratched onto the walls. In one corner, forensic teams uncovered bone fragments and articles of clothing. The items were sent for DNA analysis immediately. The weight of the discoveries bore heavily on everyone involved, especially Martinez. She had long struggled with the darkness of the case, but now the scale was overwhelming. Each day brought fresh evidence of cruelty and betrayal. Late nights at the precinct often found her staring at maps, piecing together movements, and wondering how such evil had been hidden in plain sight. Her resolve, however, never wavered. With mounting evidence and witness testimonies, warrants were issued for Gregory Miles and several others implicated in the ring. The arrests were coordinated carefully to prevent tipping off the suspects. The day of the raids, law enforcement swept through homes and properties, confiscating computers, documents, and other potential evidence. Miles was found at his lavish home surprisingly calm. When confronted, he denied involvement, claiming ignorance of Jensen's actions. News of the arrests broke in Millersville and beyond. The trial that followed was one of the most closely watched in the region's history. Prosecutors presented a harrowing case, filled with survivor testimonies, forensic evidence, and a clear portrayal of a criminal network that had operated for years under the radar. Public reaction was mixed: outrage, grief, disbelief. For the families of the missing children, it was a step toward justice, though the wounds remained raw. Amid the sorrow, the community began efforts to heal. Memorials were erected, and support groups formed for survivors and families. Detective Martinez, while proud of the progress, knew that the scars of this tragedy would last a lifetime. As the dust settled, more remains were identified, and the true scope of the crime began to come into focus. The network dismantled, the perpetrators brought to justice, and the voices of the lost children finally heard. Yet, questions lingered: how many more secrets remained buried, and could such darkness ever truly be eradicated? The courtroom was silent except for the occasional rustle of papers and whispered conversations. Detective Laura Martinez sat near the prosecution table, her mind racing as the trial entered its third week. Each day brought fresh testimonies, some heartbreaking, others chilling, but it was clear that the web of conspiracy was deeper and darker than anyone had initially imagined. As the prosecution laid out the connections among the suspects, a breakthrough came unexpectedly, shifting the entire direction of the case. It was a cold morning when Martinez received an encrypted message on her secure line from an anonymous source. The message was brief, but alarming. "Look to the river. There's something buried beneath the old bridge. Time is running out." The old bridge referenced was a decaying wooden structure spanning the Millersville River, about 5 miles from the Jensen property. Though skeptical, Martinez knew better than to ignore such clues. She coordinated a search team immediately. The winter fog hung low as divers and forensic experts combed the muddy riverbed and surrounding banks. The area was known for treacherous currents and dense undergrowth, but the team was determined. After hours of scouring, a metallic box emerged from beneath the silt near the river's edge. Inside, The investigators found carefully sealed manila envelopes, each containing weathered photographs, documents, and handwritten notes. The photographs were haunting, grainy images of children, some smiling, others wide-eyed and fearful, taken at various locations around Millersville. The notes were in a shaky script, detailing dates, names and cryptic references such as shipment, handoff and safe house. Most disturbing were the references to a Project Hollow, a term unfamiliar to Martinez, but clearly significant. The documents hinted at coordination beyond the local perpetrators, suggesting involvement of outside parties, possibly spanning multiple states. The existence of Project Hollow implied an organized operation, one that used the town of Millersville as a hub for trafficking children. Martinez's team cross-referenced the names and dates in the documents with missing persons cases across neighboring counties and states. The pattern was clear, disappearances matching the timeline and modus operandi. This discovery transformed the investigation from a local tragedy into a sprawling network of crime with national implications. Word of the findings leaked despite tight security. Suddenly, witnesses who had been silent out of fear or loyalty began to come forward. Some sought protection and offered accounts of clandestine meetings, blackmail, and threats made to ensure silence. Among these was an elderly man, a former employee at a shipping company, who recalled irregular shipments to a private dock near Millersville in the mid-1980s. His testimony confirmed suspicions that goods, and perhaps people, were moved under the cover of legitimate business operations. Further digging uncovered that some influential local politicians had received donations from individuals implicated in the network. Though no direct evidence linked them to the crimes, their financial ties raised questions about corruption and complicity in allowing the ring to flourish. Martinez knew that exposing these connections could lead to political backlash, but was committed to following the truth wherever it led. Meanwhile, families of the missing children continued to grapple with the unfolding revelations. Some, like the Thompsons and the Harrisons, had kept hope alive for decades, clinging to memories and fragments of information. Others faced the unbearable pain of partial closure, knowing their loved ones were victims of horrific crimes, but still unable to find remains or definitive answers. Counselors worked tirelessly to provide support, but the emotional toll was immense. The case captured national headlines as the scale of the conspiracy became apparent. Documentaries, news specials, and podcasts delved into the story, interviewing survivors, law enforcement, and experts. While the attention brought resources and public support, it also intensified scrutiny on the investigation and reignited old wounds in the community. The evidence from the river revealed coordinates leading to several isolated properties in rural areas around Millersville. Excavations at these sites uncovered more hidden chambers, some filled with makeshift bedding, others with remnants of items belonging to children. Forensic teams worked painstakingly to recover and identify any remains, searching for clues that might finally bring full closure. Detective Martinez often found herself haunted by the faces of the missing children. The weight of the investigation, the endless layers of betrayal and cruelty, wore heavily on her. She struggled to balance the drive for justice with the emotional exhaustion that crept into her days and nights. Yet she found strength in the resilience of survivors and the determination of the families. Advancements in forensic science aided the investigation in ways previously impossible. DNA analysis from recovered remains began to identify several of the missing children, bringing bittersweet relief to their families. Digital forensics on confiscated computers uncovered email chains and files that documented parts of the trafficking ring's operations. Arrests continued across multiple states as coordinated efforts by federal and local agencies dismantled the trafficking network. Many of the arrested faced charges ranging from kidnapping and trafficking to obstruction of justice. While some cooperated, others remained defiant, maintaining silence or denying involvement. The community of Millersville was forever changed. Trust in institutions and neighbors was shattered, replaced with a cautious wariness. Local leaders sought to rebuild, implementing safeguards and education programs to prevent such atrocities from happening again. Despite the darkness, moments of hope emerged. Reunions between survivors and families, though rare, brought joy amid sorrow. Communities across the nation rallied to support victims of trafficking, inspired by the courage of those who spoke out. Detective Martinez knew the investigation was far from over. Many questions remained: how extensive was the network? Were other towns involved? And how to protect future generations? The echoes of the past served as a grim reminder of the work still ahead. The discovery of Project Hollow, and the unraveling of the trafficking network, had sent shockwaves through Millersville and beyond. But for Detective Laura Martinez and her team, the hardest part was just beginning. Each new piece of evidence opened doors to darker truths, and every revelation deepened the mystery of just how far the corruption and cruelty extended. As the investigation moved forward, the team faced growing challenges: threats, misinformation, and the difficult task of piecing together decades-old crimes, with fragmented records and fading memories. Yet they pressed on with relentless determination, compelled by the faces of the missing children and the hope of justice. With the connections between the missing children and Project Hollow established, detectives nationwide revisited cold cases that had gone unsolved for decades. The common thread, children disappearing under similar circumstances, provided a fresh framework for understanding and investigation. Martinez coordinated with other agencies, sharing findings and pooling resources. Many cases that once seemed isolated now appeared linked, their victims tragically connected by the same sinister network. In one Midwestern town, investigators reopened the case of 3 siblings, who vanished in 1983 during a summer picnic. The pattern of their disappearance, the timeline, and the presence of unfamiliar vehicles near the site fit the profile established by Millersville's discoveries. The search expanded beyond the initial sites near Millersville. Based on the coordinates found in the river documents, federal agents and forensic archaeologists began scouring properties that had long been abandoned or under suspicion. One of these sites was an old farmstead outside a rural Pennsylvania town, left to decay after its owners mysteriously vanished in the late 1980s. The land was thick with overgrowth, and beneath the earth, investigators discovered a network of tunnels and chambers. The smell of decay was faint but undeniable. Inside, the team found remnants of makeshift cages and personal belongings belonging to several children, fragments of toys, faded clothing, and notebooks with childish handwriting. These findings confirmed the horrifying truth: the network had used these locations as temporary holding cells before moving victims to other destinations. Among the breakthroughs was the testimony of a woman who identified herself only as Emily. She had escaped the network in 1987 as a teenager, and had lived with her trauma in silence for decades. Emily recounted a harrowing escape from one of the safe houses. Her story detailed the manipulation, threats, and violence used to control the children, as well as the complex methods traffickers employed to avoid detection: coded messages, false identities, and the exploitation of corrupt officials. Her courage to come forward reinvigorated the investigation, providing first-hand accounts that filled critical gaps in understanding the network's operations. Emily's testimony also shed light on the role of certain officials who had enabled or ignored the trafficking ring. She spoke of a police officer who was complicit, turning a blind eye in exchange for bribes and threats. Martinez's team began to pursue internal investigations, scrutinizing years of police records, communications, and personnel files. The level of corruption was staggering. Some officers had been quietly removed or reassigned, but others still held influential positions. This internal rot posed a serious threat to justice and public trust. Martinez grappled with the knowledge that those sworn to protect had been among the perpetrators. The families of the missing children formed a coalition, a united front to demand justice and reforms. They held vigils, organized awareness campaigns, and worked closely with advocacy groups. The coalition's most powerful weapon was their shared pain, which transcended individual loss and created a collective voice that could not be ignored. Their efforts pressured lawmakers to pass new legislation targeting human trafficking and improving victim support services. Advances in technology provided critical assistance. Satellite imagery helped locate previously unknown properties linked to the network, while improvements in DNA testing allowed for quicker identification of recovered remains. Digital forensics uncovered a trove of encrypted files on seized computers, revealing detailed records of transactions, names and dates. Decryption took months but ultimately exposed an international dimension, links to trafficking rings in other countries, suggesting a global web rather than a localized operation. Investigators uncovered that the network had used the dark web to facilitate communication and transactions. Online forums hidden beneath layers of encryption hosted auctions and discussions about trafficking victims. With assistance from cybercrime experts, Martina's team penetrated some of these circles, gathering evidence and identifying participants. Though many remained anonymous, a handful of individuals were traced and arrested, though the true masterminds remained elusive. Psychological toll on the team.
The emotional burden on the investigative team was immense. Days spent sifting through evidence of child abuse, exploitation and death left many agents struggling with secondary trauma. Martinez herself battled sleepless nights, haunted by the children's faces and their stories. The department provided counseling and peer support, but the scars ran deep. Millersville's residents were divided. Some wanted to move on, to forget the horror and rebuild their lives. Others demanded accountability and change, wary of anyone who might have been involved or turned a blind eye. The town underwent a painful reckoning, confronting past failures and working toward a safer future. Despite setbacks and the complexity of the case, progress was undeniable. Numerous arrests had been made, and trials were underway. Survivors' voices were finally heard, and families gained long overdue answers. Legislative changes strengthened protections and improved coordination between agencies. Though the shadow of Project Hollow loomed large, the efforts to dismantle it marked a turning point. Detective Martinez knew that while many chapters had closed, others were just beginning. The fight against human trafficking was ongoing, requiring vigilance, compassion and determination. For the children who had vanished, for their families, and for the community that endured, the hope was that no more would suffer in silence. The courtroom became the new battleground. After years of painstaking investigation and gathering evidence, the case against those involved in the trafficking ring known as Project Hollow finally moved into the public eye. For Detective Laura Martinez, the families of the missing children, and the survivors who had found the courage to testify, these trials represented the possibility of justice and closure, but they also brought fresh challenges and heartbreak. The prosecution team faced a daunting task. The case was complex, with multiple defendants charged with a range of crimes: kidnapping, child trafficking, abuse, murder and conspiracy. Many of the accused were powerful figures, some with connections to law enforcement, politicians and wealthy elites. Detective Martinez worked closely with prosecutors to organize the evidence, prepare witnesses, and build airtight cases. Hundreds of pages of testimonies, forensic reports, and digital records had to be meticulously reviewed and linked to each defendant. But the defense teams were equally determined, hiring top lawyers who specialized in dismantling cases with technicalities and casting doubt on witness credibility. The first trial centered on Michael Anders, a businessman accused of acting as a middleman in the trafficking network. He was charged with facilitating the transport and sale of children and maintaining safe houses. From the opening statements, the courtroom was tense. Prosecutors painted a chilling picture of Anders' role, using testimonies from survivors like Emily and forensic evidence from the abandoned sites. Emily took the stand, her voice trembling as she recounted her abduction and abuse, pointing directly at Anders as one of the men responsible for her captivity. The defense attacked her credibility, suggesting trauma had distorted her memories. They presented Anders as a successful entrepreneur who had been falsely accused. But the prosecution's evidence was compelling: intercepted communications, financial records, and even photographs found during the searches. After weeks of testimony, the jury deliberated for 3 days before returning a guilty verdict on multiple counts, including child trafficking and conspiracy. News of Anders' conviction made headlines across the country. For many, it was a victory and a sign that the long-sought justice was within reach. Yet the media attention was double-edged. Some outlets sensationalized the case, focusing on lurid details rather than the human suffering and systemic failures. Survivors and families expressed mixed feelings, relief tempered by renewed pain. Martinez carefully managed press interactions, emphasizing the importance of respectful coverage and reminding the public that the trials were about truth, healing, and accountability. The remaining defendants, some of whom held positions of power, mounted fierce legal defenses. Their lawyers filed motions to suppress evidence, claiming violations of due process and questioning the legality of search warrants. They attempted to discredit key witnesses, including Emily and other survivors who had come forward. In one high-profile hearing, a former police officer implicated in the corruption scandal was acquitted due to lack of evidence and procedural errors. These setbacks frustrated the prosecution and families, but Martinez refused to give up. She continued to gather evidence, re-interview witnesses, and push for transparency. The courtroom process was emotionally grueling for survivors. Testifying meant reliving trauma, facing hostile defense attorneys, and being scrutinized by strangers. Support services were vital. Counselors, victim advocates, and family members provided comfort and strength. Emily described her experience as both empowering and terrifying, a chance to reclaim her story, but at great personal cost. Her bravery inspired others to come forward, strengthening the case against additional defendants. Midway through the trials, a breakthrough came when digital forensic experts decrypted a set of files on a seized hard drive. These files contained video footage, financial transactions, and communications that directly implicated several high-ranking individuals. The prosecution introduced this new evidence in court, causing shockwaves. The defense tried to challenge its authenticity, but expert testimony verified the data's integrity. This led to the indictment of additional suspects and expanded the scope of the investigation. The trials raised complex legal and ethical questions: how to ensure fair trials amid intense public scrutiny, how to balance the rights of the accused with the demands for justice. Judges worked to maintain order and impartiality, often reprimanding attorneys for inflammatory tactics. Martinez observed the proceedings with a mix of hope and caution, aware that the legal system's imperfections could hinder full justice. Families of the missing children became a visible presence in the courtroom. They attended daily hearings, stood during verdicts, and sometimes spoke at sentencing. Their resilience moved many. Some had lost hope for decades, while others only recently learned the truth. They demanded accountability not just for the traffickers, but also for those who allowed the crimes to persist. After several months, sentencing began for the convicted defendants. Michael Anders received a life sentence without parole, a message that such crimes would not be tolerated. Others received varied sentences depending on their involvement and evidence against them. For some defendants, plea bargains resulted in reduced sentences in exchange for cooperation. Though some justice had been achieved, the case left lingering questions about the fate of many missing children. Efforts to locate remains and identify unidentified victims continued. The community and law enforcement pledged to remain vigilant, implementing new policies to prevent such tragedies. The courtroom battles had drawn to a close, but the story of the vanished children and the sinister network behind their disappearance was far from over. Part 14 delves deeply into the aftermath of the trials, the lingering trauma, the quest for healing, and the societal reckoning that rippled through the community and beyond. In the quiet that followed the verdicts, there was a profound sense of relief mixed with a heavy burden. For the families of the missing children, hearing guilty verdicts was a milestone, a validation that their grief was not in vain, that the long nightmare had some closure. Yet, justice had come at a cost. The wounds opened by decades of uncertainty and betrayal could not be easily mended. Detective Laura Martinez, who had spearheaded the investigation from the beginning, felt the exhaustion that came from years of relentless pursuit. The satisfaction of seeing the traffickers behind bars was tempered by the knowledge that many questions remained unanswered. Several children were still unaccounted for, their fate unknown. For survivors like Emily, the trials had brought a cathartic release, but also reopened emotional scars. Testifying against abusers required her to relive harrowing memories.
The legal spotlight thrust her back into the very darkness she had struggled to escape. The community of Millbrook and neighboring towns was forever changed. The horrific revelations about the trafficking ring, the collusion of some local officials, and the systemic failures struck a chord nationwide. Media coverage had brought the case to millions, sparking widespread conversations about child protection, abuse, and accountability. Local churches, schools, and organizations held vigils and memorials for the missing children. Town halls saw passionate debates about how the tragedy had been allowed to fester unnoticed for so long. In response, a coalition of advocacy groups and community leaders formed the Millbrook Children's Justice Alliance. Their goal was to support families affected, push for reforms, and raise awareness on child trafficking prevention. The case had exposed glaring weaknesses in local and state systems meant to safeguard children. Lawmakers, pressured by public outrage, began introducing a series of reforms: enhanced background checks for school employees, bus drivers, and caregivers to prevent potential predators from gaining access to children; improved reporting mechanisms, simplified and mandatory protocols for reporting suspected abuse or trafficking, with better protection for whistleblowers; funding for child advocacy centers, increasing resources to help victims receive counseling, legal aid, and safe shelter; interagency cooperation, establishing better communication channels among law enforcement, social services, and educational institutions to share intelligence and act quickly. Some of these bills passed quickly, others became mired in political gridlock. Still, the momentum for change was undeniable. Healing from trauma was a complex, long-term process. For survivors like Emily and others who had escaped the trafficking ring, therapy and support networks became lifelines. Many underwent years of counseling to work through PTSD, trust issues, and the aftermath of abuse. Group therapy sessions allowed them to connect with others who understood their pain. Families who had lost children faced an unbearable grief, complicated by the mystery of their loved ones' final days. Some found solace in advocacy work, channeling their sorrow into fighting for other victims. Non-profits and mental health organizations in the area increased outreach efforts. Volunteers offered everything from grief counseling to practical help like childcare and housing. Despite convictions and new evidence, dozens of children remained missing. The investigations into their whereabouts persisted, fueled by families' pleas and law enforcement's commitment. Technological advances brought new hope. Forensic teams used DNA databases to identify remains found in remote locations, some linked to the trafficking network's burial sites. Cold case detectives revisited old leads, combing through decades-old files with fresh eyes. New witnesses occasionally came forward, spurred by the publicity and the conviction of key perpetrators. In some cases, unidentified bodies were exhumed, and painstaking forensic work gave names back to victims previously lost in anonymity. The case attracted the attention of documentary filmmakers and investigative journalists, eager to tell the full story. Several documentaries aired, featuring interviews with survivors' families, law enforcement, and experts. While some praised the documentaries for raising awareness, others criticized them for sensationalism or for re-traumatizing survivors. Emily herself participated in one documentary, hoping to give a voice to the voiceless and shed light on the realities of trafficking. These media projects kept the case in public memory, encouraging ongoing vigilance and policy dialogue. One of the most profound challenges was the erosion of public trust in institutions charged with protecting children. The revelations that some officials had ignored or covered up evidence deeply wounded the community's faith in law enforcement and government. In response, police departments underwent leadership changes and adopted new transparency policies. Community oversight boards were established to review cases of abuse and trafficking. Training programs were introduced to sensitize officers and social workers to the complexities of trafficking and trauma. Though some skepticism remained, gradual efforts to rebuild trust were underway. Detective Martinez and her colleagues bore the emotional burden alongside the survivors. Investigating such disturbing crimes exacted a psychological toll, vicarious trauma, burnout, and moral injury. Many officers sought therapy and peer support to cope. Martinez became an advocate for mental health resources within the force. She reflected often on the thin line between justice and despair, the small victories against overwhelming evil, and the strength required to keep going. In the wake of the case, schools, parents, and community groups intensified efforts to educate children about personal safety and recognize signs of abuse. Programs teaching children to speak out and trust their instincts were implemented. Neighborhood watch groups expanded their focus to include protecting vulnerable youth. Local governments allocated funds to improve lighting, surveillance, and public transportation safety. Despite all efforts, some aspects of the case remained mysteries. Questions lingered about how such a vast trafficking ring had operated for so long without detection. Who else had been involved but never charged? Were all victims accounted for? These unanswered questions fueled a collective determination to prevent history from repeating. Though the story of the vanished children is marked by tragedy, the aftermath has been one of resilience, courage, and hope. The survivors' voices are louder than ever, demanding justice and change. Families continue to honor their missing loved ones with memorials, scholarships, and advocacy. Communities across the country have taken heed, enacting stronger protections and fostering awareness. For Detective Martinez, Emily, and countless others, the journey toward healing and justice is ongoing, a testament to the human spirit's refusal to be broken by darkness. As the 4 decades since the children's disappearance stretched toward the future, the community and those touched by the tragedy sought closure, not just in the courts, but in their hearts and minds. Part 15 brings this long saga to its conclusion, focusing on remembrance, lessons learned, and the enduring hope for a safer tomorrow. By the time the trials had ended and the convicted traffickers were serving their sentences, investigators continued their painstaking work. The discovery of the buried school bus and the remains of some victims had opened new avenues for forensic science. Cold case teams utilized advancements in DNA technology, forensic anthropology, and digital records to identify previously unrecognized. With each identification, a fragment of the larger puzzle was placed, offering some families a bittersweet answer. Although many victims were now named and memorialized, some remained missing. Law enforcement pledged to never abandon the search, viewing it as a moral imperative and an act of respect. In a quiet clearing near the outskirts of Millbrook, a memorial garden was dedicated in honor of the vanished children. Sculptures, plaques, and trees planted symbolized the lives lost and the community's commitment to never forget. Every year on the anniversary of the disappearance, survivors, families, officials, and residents gathered for a candlelight vigil. It was a somber yet hopeful event, a moment of unity, grief, and resolve. Emily, now an advocate and counselor, often spoke at these vigils, her voice steady despite the weight of memory. She urged attendees to continue fighting trafficking and to protect the innocent. The passage of time brought gradual healing, but the journey was lifelong. Survivors worked to reclaim their identities, pursue education, and build meaningful lives despite the trauma. Support networks expanded, with groups providing specialized care tailored to trafficking survivors. Mental health professionals developed best practices informed by experiences from the Millbrook case. Families honored their missing children through foundations, scholarships, and community projects aimed at awareness and prevention. The Millbrook case inspired widespread reforms across multiple levels of government, creation of dedicated anti-trafficking units, specialized task forces equipped to handle trafficking investigations with expertise and resources, mandatory training for all law enforcement and social workers on identifying and handling trafficking cases sensitively, victim-centered approaches, prioritizing survivors' dignity, safety, and autonomy in investigations and prosecutions, stronger legal penalties, laws increased maximum sentences for trafficking offenses and enhanced protection for witnesses. The legacy of Millbrook became a blueprint for other jurisdictions grappling with trafficking and child protection. Schools became frontline defenders in the battle against trafficking. Comprehensive programs taught children and teens about personal boundaries, warning signs, and how to seek help. Parents and educators received training to recognize signs of exploitation and how to respond. Community awareness campaigns used media and public events to keep the conversation alive. The hope was that by equipping communities with knowledge, fewer children would ever fall prey to predators. Looking back on the tragedy, there was no denying the depths of human cruelty revealed by the case. The betrayal by some trusted adults and institutions shook the community to its core. Yet within that darkness, stories of courage, resilience and solidarity emerged. Emily's escape and advocacy, Detective Martina's relentless pursuit of justice, and the family's unyielding love all illuminated the human capacity to endure and overcome. Truth had been the light that eventually pierced the shadows enveloping the vanished children. The painstaking investigations, courtroom battles and public reckoning were essential steps toward justice and healing. Remembering the victims by name, sharing their stories, and acknowledging their humanity transformed a cold case into a living legacy. The memorial garden and annual vigils served not only as places of mourning, but as reminders of the ongoing fight against trafficking and abuse. The story of Millbrook became a cautionary tale, a stark reminder that evil can thrive in silence and secrecy. It underscored the importance of vigilance, community responsibility, and institutional accountability. Generations to come would learn from this tragedy that protecting the vulnerable requires collective effort, courage to confront uncomfortable truths, and unwavering compassion. Emily's closing message echoed during the final vigil. Though the pain of what was lost will never fully fade, we have found strength in each other. We must honor those who never returned by being their voices, their protectors and their champions. Together we can build a world where no child disappears into the shadows. Detective Martinez, now retired but still active in advocacy, reflected this case tested the limits of human endurance and the justice system. But it also proved that perseverance matters. Every small victory, every rescued child, every uncovered truth is worth the fight. As the sun set on the 4 decades since the children vanished, the community remained committed to remembering, protecting and preventing. The Millbrook tragedy would forever be etched in history, a solemn chapter filled with heartbreak, courage, and ultimately, hope. The story ends not in silence, but in a chorus of voices determined to shine light into the darkest corners.